Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Just to be in the interest of time here, I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of our research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for students and improve student achievement. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started today. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during the webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. As you can see, we have quite a few folks on the host side of things today. They will be presenting some research that they have been working on transforming rural K-12 education through blended learning and gauging the student perspective of the blended learning experience. We have Laura Donna Worth, Paula Keller, Heidi Curtis, Eric Keller, and Eric Worth from Northwest Nazarene University, as well as Sharon Ribery and Nikki Walker from Idaho Digital Learning. I will let our presenters take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin. This is Dr. Paula Keller from Northwest Nazarene University, and we want to thank you for this opportunity that we have to share the student perspective of blended learning. This is actually a third research study in a series. We explored teacher perspectives previously and wanted to complete it adding student perspectives. So our team, who is all here today with the exception of Dr. Ribery and Dr. Walker, are pleased to have this conversation. We're a small group, so we hope that it can be informal and that we can learn from each other today. So Dr. Worth.
All right, and a special thank you to Michigan Virtual Learning Institute for the Fellows Program. This research was made possible with your support, and so we just thank you so much for just your opportunity to be able to showcase this research.
So, as was kind of mentioned before, this is actually the third study that we've done recently on blended learning in the classroom. To put this one into context, the first study was done in 2013. In that one, we surveyed teachers from around rural areas to find out their impact or their view of the impact of blended learning on both the classroom and the students. We asked things about student academic performance, provided targeting to support to the students, self-paced learning, communication, student engagement, those type of things. This was followed in 2014 with a qualitative study using interviews with teachers. We asked them about their understanding about blended learning, how blended learning has impacted their teaching as well as how it has impacted their students. So this study was a mixed method study. We wanted to look at student perception so we could compare and contrast their view to those of the teachers. So it had both a survey component that was like the 2013 study with teachers and a interview portion that was similar to the 2014 study. And with that, I'll pass that along to the next folks to talk about blended learning and what we define blended learning as for this particular study.
So perhaps that would be my cue. I apologize for that. Blended learning defined. Horn and Stacker is where we are, Staker is where we're looking at and deriving our definition. You can read that there right there on the slide to identify what we perceive as a definition of blended learning for this particular study. As we look at multiple places, blended learning is often described in many settings, and there are different rationales and different types. And in each of these studies, we explored the type of blended learning that was taking place in each classroom. The rotation model, and you can see there the multiple ways that rotation model could be demonstrated in a classroom. A flex model, moving in between the two, blended and face-to-face, the self-blend model, and the enriched virtual model. So in some of our presentations, we'll explore a little bit about the types of models that we saw out there. Dr. Worth is going to share a little bit about the participants of this particular study.
So this particular study, like I said, we had kind of a mixed method approach. So there was actually a survey component as well as an interview component. So there were 96 individuals who participated from 4 rural schools in the survey component. There were mostly within those 9th, 10th, 11th, and 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. Within the qualitative portion of it, we had 8 participants from three rural school districts. The people we interviewed were all 10th and 11th graders. So we got both a good sample of some different schools and different individuals for the quantitative portion, and then also a good mix with some very nice views, similar in differences with the participants in the qualitative study portion.
So we examined in the survey portion with our 96 students several categories, and we're going to explain those or share our results in these particular categories right here so that you can kind of look forward to the type of information that we're going to share with you. In communication, we explored and asked students about their abilities to communicate with each other, to communicate with their teachers, and to communicate and how they saw family and teacher relationships. The brown bar here, or that tan mustard colored bar right there, is actually results from our 2013 study, where teachers, 87% of them said that student-to-student interaction from their perspective was the same, better, or much better after the blended learning model was implemented. So we can see that that held true for both student-to-student, teacher-to-student, and teacher-to-family from a teacher's perspective. Teachers felt pretty strongly, almost 9 out of 10, and more than 9 out of 10 in all 3 of these categories, in 2 of these categories, felt that the communication was better after the implementation of blended learning. The green bar are the results from our current study, the 2015 study, where we asked student perspectives. These represent that almost 3 out of 4 of our students said that communication between student and student was the same, better, or much better after the implementation of blended learning. 77% between students and students, 76% indicated that positively between teacher and students, and 73% perceived that teacher-family communications were the same, better, or much better after the implementation. We begin to see a trend that is common through our data at this point. Teachers perceive the implementation of blended learning in a much more positive light than our students. We say that measuring and remembering not to negate that students do see it positively, just not quite as strong as our teachers. Our next slide begins to talk about academic outcomes. We asked students and teachers whether or not test scores improved. Were they better, were they much better, or were they same after the implementation? You can see very similar results in both the tests and the homework from both teacher and student perspectives. Again, teachers have a more positive view and were stronger in their positive responses, saying that test scores and homework were at least the same, better, or much better after the implementation of blended learning. Reading skills follows that same pattern. If you look below at math skills, you'll see this is really the only anomaly that we have in this particular study. And when we went in to look at why these responses were atypical compared to the other categories, what we noticed is that many students responded with not applicable, and teachers responded with not applicable as well, indicating that the particular content that they were using blended learning models for didn't directly relate to mathematics. So if we look at this, 53% of our students said that their mathematics skills were the same, better, or much better after. 42% of teachers would say that, realizing that there's a significant portion of both students and teachers who responded not applicable. If we look at the concept of self-directed learning, we identified several components that we thought were important in order to describe a learner as self-directed. Here are those 6 particular categories that we looked at. And again, the pattern is pretty strongly the same. Teachers are pretty significantly positive about students' ability, for example, to analyze what they've learned. Almost 9 in 10, or 87% of teachers said that students' ability to analyze what they learn were the same, better, or much better after the implementation of blended learning. It's interesting in line number 3, allowing me to work at my own pace. There were several qualitative comments that addressed this particular issue as well. Several of them dealt with, I wish I could do more at working at my own pace. There was a loud choice within the classroom, but not perhaps as much as a student would want. Teachers, from their perspective, 97% of them felt that students were able to work at their own pace. Students, although generally positive, did not believe it was as strong as that. So I'm going to stop for just a minute and see in those first few slides if we have any questions or clarifications. Okay, I'll keep watching the chat bar there. Okay, we'll come back to the chat bar if those questions are posted. Let's go on to the next slide, which talks about engagement and motivation. There are many studies who would indicate that student motivation is impacted positively in the blended learning environment. Our study as well indicates that teachers in particular are very positive. If these are the examples or descriptive statements that we could call a sample of engagement or motivation, you see that teacher responses are really quite positive. 90, 92%, 87% would describe students' behavior, their excitement, their motivation, their enjoyment as the same, better, or much better after the implementation. And then students, a little less positive, but still more than 50%, and in some cases almost 75%, 3 out of 4 students would indicate that their motivation was the same, better, or much better than before. So as we're looking at this slide, I was going to address this question that came up from Diane. Diane says, what can you say about the curriculum that's used? So we made and did not collect information about the curriculum. Some of these are classes and students that work with Idaho Digital Learning Academy. Others are teachers who have been through their training programs and might be using it, but might be teaching a class related to their own district curriculum. So in this particular study, we'd be limited in talking about the specific curriculum that was developed or used. Dennis, in response to you, teachers do appear to be confident about student outcomes. One of our next steps would be to actually look at evidence, remembering that this survey is both teacher perspective and student perspective and not supported by other artifacts other than their perception. Okay, thank you for those questions. Engagement, student motivation, the other probably significant piece or something that we'd like to draw your attention to is time actively working in class. Notice that teachers, again, have a much stronger sense of students' ability to be actively working in class. I think our qualitative responses give some insight into students, their number being represented by 64%, in that students do appear to be engaged. They will self-report that they're not always engaged in appropriate topics or focused on the current curriculum that is at hand. And so I think that's representative of some of the qualitative comments. This piece of data here where 64% of them said, yes, it's the same, it's better or much better. But again, 64% is one of our lowest response rates. If we go ahead and look at attendance and behavior in the next slide, it should be noted that from the teacher perspective, the second column or the second row labeled my behavior and the behavior of other students are actually the same response from a teacher's perspective. We ask students to differentiate between their behavior and the behavior of other students. From a teacher's perspective, all students are all students. So teachers respond pretty positively, feeling that the blended learning environment did positively impact student attendance and behavior. 9 out of 10, a little more than 9 out of 10, would say that the attendance was the same, better, or much better after the implementation of blended learning. Students also think that their attendance and behavior was better after the implementation of blended learning. It's interesting to note that students believe their behavior was better than those of their peers, although 72% still responded that it was the same, better, or much better afterwards. In our final slide that would share some quantitative information with you, we looked at some other potential benefits of blended learning and students' abilities to receive one-on-one help from teachers, getting resources when I miss class, the amount of feedback and how quick that feedback is. In each of these areas, teachers again perceived it really strongly that they were able to provide one-on-one help to their students, that there was a system in place where students could get resources when they had missed it, and that they were able to give better feedback or at least feedback in a more timely manner to their students. Our students perceive those components positively as well. Perhaps one of the biggest criticisms of blended learning is that students aren't able to engage socially with each other, and so we explored the concept of community building in the class. Both teachers and students viewed this positively as well, with 85% of teachers saying it was the same, better, or much better after the implementation, and 77% of students. When we looked at the quality of classwork, both students and teachers perceived it as better after the implementation of blended learning at a high percentage. So this would conclude the results that we have prepared to share with you related to the survey. We'll pause for just a minute here and ask and see if there are any additional questions or places that we could clarify. So I'm going to ask Dr. Curtis to perhaps address a little bit. Diane, your question, can you tell us a little more about the structure of your blended program? Remembering that we're researching other programs that are calling themselves blended learning, I'm going to defer to Dr. Curtis to add any additional information and perhaps answer your question more accurately.
Thanks, and Dr. Worth, you could jump in here anytime as well. So the schools that we looked at were rural in setting. They were high schools, so grades 9 through 12. Teachers had been trained by the Idaho Digital Learning Academy for the most part. There were some other students included in the survey who just from our whose teachers were engaged in blended learning just from the connections we have from the university as well, because we're often out in regular K-12 schools, and so we had seen some blended learning happening and engaged those teachers to participate in the survey as well with their high school students. Students would say that they are not on the computer, of course, every single day. They would characterize their learning as kind of seamless between home and school, so they can continue on, those types of things. Some flipping a little bit. Did students work in the virtual courses on-site or off-site? So it wasn't a fully online course. So teachers, depending on unit or content, would then have students use technology to solve problems or work on projects or those types of things. So depending on the unit, depending on the assignment, depending on what the content was, I think that depended on how often the teachers in these courses determined what students would do. Again, there was some student choice, but all of the participants, every participant in the interviews said that it was really the teacher setting the schedule. And so actually that was a bit surprising for me, because I think one of the hallmarks of blended learning is a little bit more student choice, a little more flexibility.
Dr. Curtis, I'm going to jump in here. I've gone back to the study and we chose not to share this information, but the majority of our students would say that they would define themselves, they worked online, but the teacher was present there for help when needed. The second most frequent type of blended learning described by students in the survey was they rotated between online and other activities while they were in the class. So most of them did have a class presence, the teacher was there, and then the activities were bouncing back and forth between face-to-face and online.
So Dr. Keller, there's one more question about the quant data in the text box there. Either you or Dr. Worth want to take a stab at that one?
So this is Paula. It's a great question, Dennis. I would say that there is some indication in our qualitative data to look at and perhaps confirm that teachers are a tad bit confident in the student outcomes. We're going to share some wisdom that students offered to teachers as they're implementing online and blended learning strategies. And I think there's some information in there that would indicate that students would prefer teachers to remain highly engaged, hold them more accountable, to make sure that their presence in the room is very clear so that students stay focused. So I think there perhaps is some indication in the qualitative that teachers might be missing some simple cues or ideas related to how hard their students are working or whether those outcomes are as high as they really think they are. There is, and probably a next step for us, perhaps a fourth study, to actually look at those academic outcomes. So we have perceptions. Now let's look at the artifacts that would detail whether or not those perceptions are reality by looking at artifacts, some type of assessment or end of course assessment or something like that.
And this is Eric. I would agree with that. When we look at this, I think what we're seeing in some ways is this, that teachers, they put together material, they have maybe a more in-depth reason of why they believe something may be beneficial to a student. One thing we might look at is whether or not the reasons why certain things are put into place or done a certain way is being communicated well to students. We might be assuming as teachers that students will see the benefit of why we do something a particular way where they don't really see that benefit as clearly. So that might also be leading to some of the difference in the opinions between the teachers and the students.
And this is Lori. I would just add that in some of our classrooms that we selected, it was a first-time experience for students in the blended learning environment, whereas the teachers had experienced several different classrooms that they had taught in this modality. So I think it's also the perception of students, maybe a first-time experience versus the teachers, where they might be doing some comparison of different classrooms that they've taught or groups of students.
Okay. Excellent questions. I like the discussion. Yeah, we'll move on into, this is Heidi Curtis. I worked with some of the interviews and the qualitative data in this study. So we interviewed 8 students. Our population is a bit more female than male in the students that we interviewed, the 10th and 11th graders that were selected. And so we looked at that to see if there was differences, and I don't think that really there was differences in males and females necessarily, but for future study I think it would be interesting to see if we could gather some more males and that kind of thing. So when we coded the data and then came up with themes, these were the themes that emerged from the data. So blended learning increases access to resources for students. Students really loved that they had an LMS that organized their life for them in general. They had all of their documents were in one place. They weren't worrying about carrying something around in their binder and losing it. They could submit work online, those kind of things. So they liked the organization aspect of it. They also love immediate feedback, whether that's immediate feedback from their teacher, which in this theme was, or their technology, which in this theme was the case. So I can go, if I have my device in my hand, I can go look up the answer to something, even if the teacher is talking about it. If I'm curious about it, I can go look it up. And so they really liked that. They liked that you didn't have outdated textbooks anymore because you could use a device that could help solve some of those issues for them. The second theme was that blended learning increases understanding of concepts. So this whole idea of I can go deeper in my learning. Students said a couple of times, I'd find myself looking for something online if I was doing a project for my class and then reading articles that I hadn't even intended to read. So I thought that was really fun to listen to them talk about how their learning was, how they were going deeper, and it might take them on a tangent, and so a little bit later on they say things like the teacher should help us stay on task and that kind of thing, except for if those tangents or those walkabouts, whatever you want to call them, are productive and are satisfying their curiosity and helping engage them in learning. I think that they're still very valid, but I think students have trouble differentiating between being all the way off task and going deeper in the learning if they're observing what their colleagues are doing. Here was a really important one. The third bullet point there is that teachers are still important to this process, and it came up a number of times. They want their teachers to engage them. They want them to support them. They still want that one-on-one attention. They want teachers to help, of course, keep students on task, and then the teachers set the schedule. As I mentioned before, it was really, this was pretty teacher driven. But if you look down about 3 or 4 bullet points where it says blended learning is the best of both worlds. Students love that they can have their teacher right in front of them to give immediate feedback. They can raise their hand, their teacher can come around. But then there's this mix of hands-on work, technology, and teacher direction, and then they think that's the best way to learn. And so they can get all of the good stuff right there. So I think that was really interesting data to come out of this study. The other thing they said is, I don't want my teacher just to sit behind the computer. I want my teacher to be out and around and engaging me and talking to me and questioning me about what I'm learning and that kind of thing. Here's one of the things that the students actually said, which is great. She says, I would tell them, that's the teachers, that technology is good, but don't ignore your students. Still make sure they're understanding what they're learning and answer all their questions, and don't just let them read on their own. Still teach them. So if there's people out there that think that blended learning or learning with technology will replace teachers, again, the students are saying, no, we need our teachers. We need them to be with us and help us along and that kind of thing. So I think that was something really positive to come out of this study. Students would say that they're more engaged in blended learning. It's more efficient for them. So they don't have to wait for the rest of the class. They can move forward at their own pace to some degree. They love hands-on learning. There was apparently a number of teachers that were using gaming and simulations, and then they liked the projects because they thought that they could go deeper, but they could also collaborate with their peers, and they liked that a lot. You'll see that a little bit later. They're increasing the connection as well. Student independence and this responsibility theme would come through quite a bit. So I can learn anytime in any place. So if I need to go home and continue my learning after cheerleading practice, then I can do that. It's seamless for the students. They had those that had devices at home. Those that didn't have devices at home were pretty negative about it because it caused trouble for them to have to go find a library or something where they could use a device. And again, in rural settings, it's a reality of the setting that we're using. They really love that convenience and flexibility that now existed, which they didn't feel necessarily did before. If you have a classroom set of textbooks or those kind of things, you just can't do that anytime, any place. And they liked going at their own pace. For a lot of them, what that looked like wasn't, I can do the whole course by myself. It was, my teacher gave us a unit with these 15 assignments in it, but they don't really care which order I do them or when I turn them in. I do need to stick to this, kind of final due date. And so that's what the flexibility looked like and the pacing for students. So that they have the opportunity to pace it themselves, which is great. The other thing that was interesting is that students felt like the responsibility for their own learning was more on them in the blended setting than it was. They weren't waiting for the teacher to come in and say what we're going to do today. They knew what they were going to do today, and then they had some responsibility to actually do their part of it so that they were prepared when the teacher was ready to move on. They also mentioned in this part that, of course, blended learning depends on the student. So the student must participate. And sometimes it could just become an excuse for them to not participate, right? Oh, my computer didn't work, or I didn't know what the assignment was, or, the same kinds of excuses that you might typically hear from students, just with an updated 21st century twist to them. Students would say blended learning can be more motivating when used correctly, so student motivation depends on the subject. And this fit with what was in the end of survey data as well. students, some would say some subjects just aren't so good for blended learning, so, or at least in the way that the teacher was doing it. And so they would, I mean, students don't really necessarily want math to be blended so much, or foreign language. Those are the two that kind of come up a little bit more regularly in these interviews as well. And then they talked, and then they also said that fully online for them would be a negative. They don't want to be on the computer all the time. Again, that goes back to those themes that are a little bit higher, the best of both worlds, needing my teacher, wanting that interaction with students. So they want to be blended. Blended was more positive to them. We asked at both in the survey and in the end of the interviews, we asked students to give advice, and interestingly enough, they had some. I know it would be surprising to all of you that students would have an opinion, but they do. And students, I'm going to echo myself again, combining that face-to-face with online learning. So I like the online component because of my feedback, my learning. I can go deeper, my pace, but I really need my teacher. So don't leave us alone. Let us go on and do this well together. Let's learn this together. Creating opportunities for students to interact and engage with each other. So creating those projects. One history group talked about these decades projects that they worked on as a group, and they all brought in all of their digital pieces and put them together in a presentation that they did live in the class, but then it was all housed on their LMS, and they did all of their research using technology. So that was really fun, and they got to not only use text, but they got to use sound and audio, those kind of technologies as well, which they really loved. Hold students accountable. Again, don't just leave us alone. Keep us focused. Don't just make sure we're just not on Facebook. They want to be policed still a little bit. So that's really excellent. And of course, as the quant data showed before, they're a little bit happier with their own behavior than they are with the behavior of others. But again, pretty normal for high school students. Blended learning is not for every student, so use it in moderation. Don't have us on the computer 5 days a week, every class period. We're not just tromping down to the computer lab every single day. Use it when it's appropriate and make differentiations there. And so that is an interesting. One of the students actually said, I think blended learning is fine as long as the class you're taking online is not some sort of math class. So this particular student struggled with that, whereas other students who have used Khan Academy and other blended learning scenarios in their courses have done great. Obviously, we've seen students do fully online math just excellently, but if you're a struggler or if you don't know what you can do to help your own math performance or any subject, you might find it a little more frustrating. And then they want teachers to be flexible. They want them to help manage student workloads. They want them to use things like using Google Docs and those kind of things, or let us use our headphones in class. So I'm being distracted by what else is going on in the classroom. Let us put headphones on, which I'm guessing some teacher somewhere thought that they would just be listening to music and not be engaged in what's going on. But the students wanted kind of to block out some of the activity that was going on. We also ask them to give advice to each other. And here's the kind of top 7. Don't procrastinate. So things like they would just little short, simple statements like use your time wisely, don't get behind, don't procrastinate, keep up with the online work because it's hard to catch up. Ask for help. So that's the second one. Don't do this by yourself. Ask the teacher questions, clarify things. So the same as you would hope in a fully face-to-face class or fully online for that matter, we always want our students to ask. avoid distractions, so staying focused. And they would just have little phrases again like pay attention, know when things are due, and stay organized. Be diligent. So working hard, trying your best, doing what you're asked to do, trying. One student said, try your hardest. It's the effort you put in that counts. So that's, the same thing as teachers that we try to show our students that really hard work matters. They would say the same in a blended learning situation. Interestingly enough, here in red, don't try it. This relates back to students saying, this was not a good experience for me in this particular subject matter, in this particular modality. I needed something different, or my teacher wasn't as engaged as they should have been, or I was kind of left on my own. Again, this came from the survey, which were anonymous unless students said, I'll be willing to be interviewed. And so we don't know exactly what's behind this completely, but we can decide from what we had already heard from other students from interviews that sometimes some subjects are better than others. Sometimes some teachers are better than others. Sometimes some technology is better than others. So students are pretty honest and sometimes brutally so. Students want their colleagues to be independent. So learn for yourself, take responsibility. All of these things are mirrored in the interviews as well. And then engage with your peers. Don't be all by yourself. Don't be lonely. Let's make this a community. And so I thought that was also some very good advice and interesting for our students. Questions about any of those things, there's a whole discussion that's been happening that I'm sure that my colleagues have been weighing in on. Yes, so students who answered the open-ended questions negatively were consistently negative through the survey.
Yeah, that was true when we tried to, so even though it was anonymous, we could look at the series of response questions. I can tell you there was no consistent theme. There weren't more freshmen than seniors. It wasn't all sophomores. The comments didn't reflect gender in that there were more males or females who said, hey, don't try this. It wasn't a good experience for us. So in looking to the point where we could to try to parse out information or to learn more about why this experience wasn't positive, there really weren't any strong patterns in the way that we had structured the survey.
Okay, so the next couple of slides just kind of go over some of the similarity in the themes between the study that was done with teachers in 2014 and the current one. So we got several columns here. On the left-hand side, you can kind of see some of the themes from the teacher survey, and then in the parentheses, kind of a similar theme that was emerging from the current study with students. So for example, the first one, students are engaged in a blended learning environment, and that related to questions on students actively working in a class during blended learning. The middle part shows some of the quantitative data and correlations between particular questions and that student response on their actively working in class. So you can see that there was fairly high correlations between things like my interest in classwork, interest in participating in class, general excitement, excitement to complete homework assignments out of class, and the overall quality of my classwork, and that idea of actively working in class. On the very right-hand side, we kind of have the qualitative theme that we could bring that all together in with the current student study. So in this case, it was students are more engaged, and students can be more engaged in blended learning. I think it comes with that caveat that we heard in the qualitative portion that it depends a lot on how the teacher uses it, and the subject and the teacher may determine a little bit on the student's perception on how engaging the class in general is, or any particular portion of it. Another theme that came out was this idea of self-paced learning. So in the teacher's perspective, it was self-paced learning is an important benefit that can be had in blended learning. We also asked students about that idea of blended learning and working at my own pace, and there were some strong correlations between working at my own pace and helping me master important concepts, helping me think deeper about concepts, helping me determine what I have learned and what I haven't learned, a student's ability to locate resources on their own, and then their overall interest and quality of the classwork. So overall, this theme that came out of the students was that student independence can increase with blended learning, and then that idea that self-paced learning is kind of a sub-theme within there. A couple others that emerged in the teacher survey and in interviews: the blended learning motivates students in the classroom. So this idea of, can blended learning motivate students? And there were correlations between excitement in class, confidence in students' ability, enjoyment of school, community building, and even their ability to get one-on-one help from their teacher. So qualitatively, we saw that, and students indicated in the qualitative portion that blended learning can be motivating when it's used correctly. So it's that kind of two sides of the coin. It can be really good when used correctly. Also, students can perceive it as not good at all if it's used in a way that they don't see as being appropriate. And then kind of a final one here, students are self-directed learners in the blended learning environment. And I think we all want that from students. We know that we can't teach them everything in the class or in high school. We want them to be able to be self-directed so that they can go and find their own resources and take those steps towards being more of a independent, self-driven individual who can learn in environments outside of school, and then they can find their own things without having a teacher needing to give it to them and tell them what to do with it. So we had students taking this responsibility. There was correlations between their grades on homework and grades on tests. Those type of things give us confidence that from the perception point of the student, if they take greater responsibility for their work, they feel like their homework is better, their tests are better, that they have a better ability to persevere when they're struggling. It helps them analyze better what they can learn in class. And so again, the theme that comes out of this is this idea that in blended learning, there is that opportunity for the teacher to help foster an environment where students start to be more independent, less of depending on the teacher to provide information and the context and the resources that can come out of that, and more of the students themselves feeling like they have the skills and the ability to go find those pieces that they need to be successful and to bring those into the classroom and to make that a part of their learning experience. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and put up the last slide, questions and answers. I know that we have started quite a bit already through the chat window, but this would be a good opportunity if we haven't covered something yet, or if somebody has a question that's come up, that we could participate or hopefully answer that for you. So we have a few people typing in there, so we'll hang on and see if anybody has any questions.
So Catherine, this is Paula. I love your questions. Of course, there are always lots of studies that emerge in your mind. Studies really lead to many more questions. One of the things that I'm curious about, although we didn't have significant numbers or our N wasn't big enough, I think that there was likely going to be patterns emerging based on the school. And I'm curious to know the level of professional development that happened in that school before blended learning took place, and then connecting that to the student experience. So where there weren't clear patterns established for students who had negative experiences, I think if our N would have been bigger, that we might have seen more patterns emerge about the type of blended learning model that they were being engaged in, perhaps the teacher's experience. So I'm curious, and maybe a next step would be to explore that a little more in depth.
And Dennis, I like your question too about how that sense of place might factor into things. I think it's difficult to say, but an interesting way to look at the future studies might be how does somebody taking a course that's developed outside of school, where they come in, that model where they are in the classroom with the teacher, but they're really mostly taking the class online, how results from that might differ than a situation where the teacher comes in and does something like a flipped classroom, where they're primarily in the classroom with the students, and they're kind of that more back and forth between the face-to-face component and the that individual has created, and the online component that the teacher has also created within that district. So that would be an interesting dynamic to look at as well.
So Kristen, I'm going to go back to one of those slides and try to answer your question a little bit about the correlation analysis. So the first sentence in that first line, students are engaged in the blended learning environment, was an item that actually was highly correlated with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the variable 2 in the first study. What we wanted to do was look at the fact that they were correlated in the teacher study. Were they correlated in the student study as well? And so that's where those R values are. It was an attempt for us to try to connect the pieces. So students are engaged in the blended learning environment. Teacher responses to that in the first study were correlated at 0.587 at a p-value of 0.000 to my interest in classwork in our first study. So what's interesting then is that we're also seeing those, and we don't have the second column here that would say here's the R value here in the new study, but that both our qualitative things and the quantitative things that had some correlations that were beginning to look very interesting were related in several levels. So it's just a piece of work we're kind of looking at to see, much like the question that Dennis answered earlier, are teachers just more optimistic or overly confident, or are they related in similar ways to student perceptions? So Justin, I'm not sure, and we'd be happy to answer any other questions, but we just did want to take the opportunity to thank Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and the good folks there who have worked with us and partnered with us in many ways. Thanks for this opportunity, and thanks for the partnership as we continue to explore the good things that happen in blended learning environments.
And we, of course, return the thanks to you. Thank you to all of our presenters today for presenting such valuable research and for engendering such a great conversation. All of our participants here are incredibly participatory, great conversations being had around the study itself. And so again, thank you. But while we wrap up, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. And then to our presenters, if you'd like to share your contact information for anyone who may want to follow up with you afterward, please feel free to do that in the chat box as well. So we really appreciate that. Just a couple of other things that we wanted to hit on before we wrap up today. Be sure to check out, if you're interested, our podcast, our Virtual Viewpoints podcast. We just released an episode this week in which we sat down with Julia Freeland-Fisher, who is the new Director of Education Practice at the Clayton Christensen Institute. So some exciting conversations with her around her research in blended and competency-based education. So we encourage you to check out that episode. You can do so by clicking the link there or searching for us in iTunes. You can also check out our guest blogger program. So if anyone out there is interested in writing for us, you can click that link there and learn about our guest blogger program, where we provide a stipend for you to present some research of your own or highlight some research that you know of and write for our blog platform. We also wanted to plug a couple of upcoming events. Our team will be hosting the K-12 Research Community Meeting as a pre-conference to the INACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium, and that'll be taking place November 8th, 2015, from 1 to 4 p.m. That would be an afternoon session, and we wanted to make note that it is free registration, but you do have to add it on to your overall conference registration. So if you would like some more information on all of the pre-conferences, including ours, you can click that link there and look for the K-12 Research Community Meeting there. We do have, I believe, Catherine, around 40 or 50 signed up already and only 70 capacity in the room, so get a spot while they're still available. We'll be doing our best to put on a good show for you guys. We'll be talking a little bit about different grant opportunities. We'll have some folks from different foundations who are doing work in this space to share some grant and funding opportunities, and then we'll have some networking time, as well as some breakout sessions around different topics of interest. And as Catherine points out there, one of our fellows, Kathy Kavanaugh, will be keynoting. So we're very excited for a great meeting in Orlando this November. We are also hosting another webinar, the next webinar in our webinar series, on K-12 mobile learning. We'll be hearing from, again, Kathy Kavanaugh and two of her co-authors on the chapter that they wrote for the handbook of research on blended online learning, and it's on K-12 mobile learning. Because one of our presenters is based in Perth, Australia, we'll be doing that webinar at 9 p.m. Eastern on November 18th. But you can find out more information about that by visiting our website, which I will bring up now. You can visit us at MVLRI.org. If you have suggestions, feedback about any of our initiatives or projects, you can email us at mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list, where we actually remind folks of upcoming webinars, podcast release, blog posts, etc. You can do that by clicking the link there and signing up for our MailChimp list. And you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. All of our handles and sites are listed there. And then our YouTube channel, where I will be posting a recording of this webinar today, should be up tomorrow. So take a look there, and you can also take a look at all of the archived recordings of our webinars, which are very helpful for people who can't make it for the synchronous sessions themselves. And then you can see a list of all of our upcoming webinars, as well as our archived webinars, on our website, mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. Thanks, Catherine, for mentioning that their chapter is located in that link, if anyone is interested, that she posted there in the chat box as well. Again, thank you to our presenters so much. Thank you to our participants, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their week. Take care.